Good morning and welcome to the Wavy Digital Desk. I'm your host, Sarah Good. Today we're going to be speaking about new poll results showing Trump ahead by 2 in the state of Virginia. Now, the poll results just came out this morning, just at 5 a.m. this morning, actually. So if you're up bright and early, you've already taken a look. Maybe you can look at the statistics. But we're going to be having Emerson College on today to talk about them. Now, Emerson College and The Hill put this poll together for Next Star Stations to take a deeper dive at what's happening in Virginia. Now, we know over the past few days what has happened. Now, these poll results are really recent, now just July 14th to 15th. So we're going to take a better look at all of them. Matt Taglia, Senior Director at Emerson College Polling, is going to be with us taking a look, maybe what was surprising, maybe not, maybe where some of the impact can be. So we're going to bring him on now. Matt, thanks so much for joining us this morning.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Just to start, can you tell us what this poll is? Tell us what it was tracking. Tell us maybe why Virginia was important.
Yeah, well, this was a presidential race poll. We took it over the past weekend, so Sunday and Monday of this week. I think the importance is to see how exactly things have changed since 2020. I believe this was our first poll of Virginia in this presidential election cycle. And so we got to see some of those results and how things have changed since 2020, 2022. I think we can see that the state is potentially in play.
And going into this election cycle, I know that especially in last week, very tumultuous. Obviously, a lot has occurred. So I think that it's very important to highlight that this is so recent, as you said, just July 14th and 15th, because it's taking into account a lot of things that have happened in the past few days.
That's right. The news cycle has moved very quickly. So we can be at least confident that some of that is taken into account in this poll. I don't know if this is the first poll released following the shooting in Pennsylvania, but I think that is accounted for in this data. I don't know that there was necessarily movement between pre-shooting versus post-shooting, and I'm sure that the Republican National Convention has had some effect as well.
Absolutely. To start, obviously the headline is Trump is leading by 2, but what the poll really shows, and I'll bring it up on screen in a minute, is that a lot of voters still remain undecided. And that 11.2% of voters that remain undecided, I feel like that could have a lot of impact.
That could have a lot of impact. We've seen this across other states as well, swing states especially, that somewhere between 8 and 12% of the electorate is still undecided. Now, that's largely sort of younger voters, some minority voters, but these are coalitions that are typically in the Democratic camp, and we see that Biden is not necessarily winning those. Trump isn't necessarily winning those, but he's more competitive. And so there's work for either campaign to do there to shore up that undecided vote.
And when we looked at, what would happen if the undecided voters had to make a decision, right, had to choose either Trump or Biden, that's putting it even closer. Now we're, I think it was only basically a percentage away, 50.4% to 49.6%. So depending on how they vote, that is going to be a pretty close matchup if that remains.
Yeah, it's a tied race. I think even without the push, it's more or less a tied race. But a tied race in Virginia is not what you want if you're the Biden campaign. It's a state that he won by about 10 points in 2020. This is not good news for the Biden campaign. It's showing that the Trump campaign is certainly competitive here. There's work to be done on both sides, but obviously the margins are incredibly close.
And absolutely. And, Virginia traditionally ends up being a blue state. However, obviously with Governor Youngkin coming in, and we'll get to some results about him in a second, that has been at play. So we've seen now a Republican governor. And I think the question has been what's going to happen this election, because sometimes that can foreshadow. But that close of a proximity, you said 10 points from 2020. Now we're with the same candidates, obviously, in a different scenario. How nervous, I guess, should people be in maybe taking a look at those undecided voters and trying to sway them one way or the other, I'll say.
Well, I don't know about nervous, but I think that they'll have to approach these undecided voters with some deliberation. These are largely less interested, uh, less informed voters. Some of these folks are voting for the first time because they've just aged into the voting age population. And some of these are folks who may vote this year, didn't vote in maybe 2020 or 2022. So they're really just paying attention to the absolute headlines and not necessarily going deeper than that. So, they're also going to have things on their mind like the economy and inflation. These are things that they see every day. When they go to the grocery store, when they go to the gas station, they're seeing that, and those things are going to be top of mind. So the campaigns are going to have to speak to that. I know that right now at the RNC, the Trump campaign has tried speaking to that, releasing plans and data on what they hope to accomplish. The Biden campaign is doing the same, but both of them are going to have to make the case that one or the other is going to be better for the economy and it's going to be better for people's pocketbooks at the end of the day.
Right. And, by the polling data, the economy was on top of everyone's minds. And I did double check to see if that was across political parties, and it was. Whether you're Democrat, Republican, Independent, you also ranked the economy as one of the top issues, the most important issues in Virginia.
That's right. That was across party lines. It does change a little bit once you get to the sort of secondary issues. So for Republicans, that's immigration. For Democrats, I believe that is housing affordability, which tracks along with the economy, I'd say. And then for independents, interestingly, it's threats to democracy. Now, that requires some interpretation. Who that benefits is anyone's guess right now. But I think it remains that the economy, inflation, that's going to be a number one priority. And then a little bit further down in some states, abortion is also going to play a major role. I know it isn't necessarily the top issue for any party in Virginia, but it is something that is still on voters' minds, especially in some of the states where it will be on the ballot.
Absolutely. And especially, at least down here in Hampton Roads, I'll say that housing affordability to be that second, on mind for Democrats, that's pretty powerful down here. I think that's a big issue at play in a lot of especially urban areas across the state. So that could be really important, to focus on as well.
I completely agree. You see this especially in certain communities across the country, places that are growing quickly, and places that have, a significant portion of the population that are under a certain age. So, especially in the Sun Belt, where these 30-year-olds, some 40-year-olds, expect to own a home, but they can't right now, and that goes hand in hand with that economy number. I think that there is something to gain from the campaign speaking to this issue. I know the Biden campaign has talked about rent, capping rental costs, but I don't know that that's necessarily the track here. I think folks want to own a home. They see the housing crisis, and something needs to be done to address that if they hope to capitalize on these voters, especially these voters who are under the age of 40 or 50.
And, immigration being the second top for Republicans, that was no shock, obviously, in some of the rhetoric that we're seeing at the RNC as well. To you, I mean, what did you make of all of the critical issues? Are you also taking a look maybe at what tracks, what's being broadcast, I guess, on the news and sort of in their speeches at the RNC?
Sure. Immigration in particular, that's been a hot button issue. We saw it sort of crest, though, in roughly January, February of this year. And since then, it's had a little bit of a decline, I'd say. So I think, the economy, that's just perpetually number one. Immigration has been a little bit less of a concern. It's been much more regional. So some of those states in the Northeast, actually, where some of the migrants have been transplanted at certain points of the year. Immigration was tracking as a top issue there. We're seeing a little bit less so in some of the states like Virginia, where it might not necessarily be, you know, major concern in some areas. It is still there. It is still very much a Republican-centered issue, but we do see a sizable number of independents concerned about immigration as well.
And the other thing I want to jump to that's also, been in the news the last few weeks, I should say, ever since the debate that we're seeing on screen, is whether or not Biden should step down and Kamala Harris, come on to the scene as the presidential candidate. And you all did poll that data, and it was still close. It's not like it was a landslide that Kamala tracked it up 10 points, but it was still a close race. Can you talk about the importance, I guess, in asking that question?
Yeah, I think the headline from that question was that it doesn't really move the needle. I think the important thing to take away, though, is that the Democratic side doesn't necessarily lose ground as a result of Harris at the top of the ticket. There's a lot to be said for being a sitting president, the Democratic nominee, and Vice President Harris doesn't have the benefit of that right now. So I think that we see a little bit of muted support. People do know who she is. She has the highest name ID of any of the potential Democratic nominees who would replace President Biden. So she does have that going for her, but she doesn't have the benefit of those titles yet. And she doesn't have the benefit of, say, campaign spending and some of the media attention that has followed President Biden. So, I think the takeaway there is that, Harris is a contender. She holds her own in these top line numbers. She doesn't lose significant ground among any demographics. And so, we thought it was important to test that since headlines, even this past morning, have seemed to insinuate that President Biden is at least considering stepping aside.
Right, and especially in the last 24 hours, as we hear sort of larger names in the Democratic Party talking to him about it, making statements, out to the press about it. So I think it's really interesting to see, and there you're seeing it on screen. If you're watching, 8.7% still remain undecided in that. I did want to say, too, and I'll pull it up as well, you also polled these independent candidates, the third-party candidates, and I think that was really interesting, especially in this race. Can you talk about why that was so important, where maybe in elections past, they haven't really been looked at maybe with the same, seriousness?
Yeah, and I think the sort of headline there is Kennedy. Some of these other candidates like Cornel West, Jill Stein, they are relatively known commodities, at least as far as third parties go. So they do attract some vote share, but Kennedy is the one who could really play a spoiler in some of these states. We see younger voters, minority voters in particular, being attracted to Kennedy. We see some defection from independents as well. So that will certainly play a part if and when he is on the ballots in these states. I think it could be anywhere on election day, at least, somewhere in that 5% range potentially. I know that we see sort of inflated support in some of these polls. I wouldn't necessarily take that as gospel of what's going to happen on election day. I think his vote share does shrink, assuming he is on the ballot. But there's obviously a desire for another option here. I think that that's the headline. And I think that some of these voters who aren't necessarily the highest propensity voters, so don't always vote in every election, they're the ones who are most likely to defect to a Kennedy ticket.
And I think there was a big question, is Kennedy taking away votes? Obviously, this poll didn't look at that, but I think this poll is interesting in framing that question, to the public. Does he take votes for voters that would go to Trump naturally, or voters that would go to Biden? So I think that will be an interesting thing to see closer to the election as well.
Yeah, I agree. And it's not, we try to phrase it like that at the national level. It's not true across all states that that Kennedy is taking votes from one candidate or the other. However, in Virginia, he is getting getting votes from that sort of traditional Democratic coalition, some younger voters, minority voters, and then independents. That's a little bit harder if you're the Biden campaign. So we can see some indication there that, these are, presumably Biden's voters to lose in a normal election year, the Democratic candidates' voters to lose. But a lot of them are defecting to Kennedy. I say a lot, it's still a minority, but when you've got margins this close, losing even 5 to 10%, that can make a huge difference.
And I want to pull up on screen too, the approval ratings, and I'll just go back to this one with undecided voters. The approval ratings for Biden are sort of another question that I feel like has a lot of weight here. Obviously, he's the sitting president. So the approval ratings for Biden and how people feel the country is moving, whether forward in the right direction or on the wrong track, that was an interesting question that obviously I think plays into the role if people are going to vote for Biden.
Absolutely. I think, it's an indicator of vote intention and how people feel generally. So we see that Biden does not have terribly high approval. That goes for Virginia, that goes for everywhere in the country, frankly. And so he's got an uphill battle here because he has to convince folks that the country is headed in the right direction, that he's doing a good job, but also that 2, 3, 4 years from now, it's going to be in an even better place. So that's a lot. And, the question remains as to whether he can do that. I think we see that folks in Virginia are overall satisfied with the way the state is headed. We can see that across party lines. Majorities say that it's headed in the right direction, but they don't necessarily approve of Biden. They don't necessarily approve of the direction of the country as a whole.
Yeah, and that seemed also to be across the board. I mean, even Democrats were saying 50-50, I think it was, whether they approve or disapprove of Biden's job. I mean, I think the other thing, and I know that we can't get into all the stats here, so I'm going to try to, keep this brief, but it was interesting to see where Democrats and Republicans were voting across party lines. And we did see it was a small percentage, but there are some Democrats that are going to vote Trump, and there are some very fractional, I think it was only like 4% Republicans that are going to vote for Biden. So, I mean, really, that's probably not surprising. I mean, it's such a small number. Does that mean anything to you?
No, it's not something that I would dwell on. If there were really substantial numbers going for one candidate or the other, then that would be a red flag to me. But when we see it at that sort of under 15%, say, range, that you've got to expect that some people who have identified at least as a Democrat or a Republican at some point and still have an affinity for that party, they may not in reality vote for Democrats across the board in the first place. They may be closer to independents. So I don't see that defection as necessarily something to look at for broader trends or for an indication of defection at the ballot box.
And in terms of, the poll, I know there were so many different things that we can extract from it, depending on age groups, depending on party lines, depending on undecided voters. Is there anything in particular that you all at Emerson College are looking at that came maybe as a surprise to you, or just something to keep an eye on potentially for future polls going towards the 2024 election?
Yeah, I've mentioned it already. The younger voters are very different this election cycle. We see closer margins between President Trump and former President Biden. I'm sorry, President Biden and former President Trump. We see that. We see the same thing with minority voters, closer margins, especially African American voters. I say close, but that's speaking in relative terms here. But Trump earning up to 20%, nearly 20%, depending on which test we're looking at. So that's something that should be concerning for Democrats. The other thing that's interesting is that even among extremely motivated voters, we see that Trump is ahead there. He's at roughly, I think, 3 points ahead of Biden. That's something that we're keeping an eye on. We've seen somewhat consistently that these really extremely motivated voters are breaking more for Donald Trump than Joe Biden. Now, that's not necessarily a huge surprise. You're going to see in polling that the folks who are not currently in power are uh, often going to be more motivated to vote out the current sitting president. But we're seeing that across the board. And in the most recent election years, we've seen Democrats have more of an enthusiasm edge against Republicans. That trend seems to be reversing now. Republicans are more motivated. So we're going to keep an eye on that. I think the RNC and then later on the DNC, that could impact that motivation, especially depending on who ends up at the top of the Democratic ticket.
That's really interesting. And you wonder, obviously, this is not a new candidate in Trump, but maybe just the, support and passion maybe around him, the MAGA movement or whatever it might be is just looking more attractive and more motivating to get out to the polls. And I do want to say, just at the RNC yesterday, they're preaching about voting early, voting any way you can. There seems to be a different level of encouragement this election season for people. So that'll be interesting to see how motivated people are to get ahead of it this year.
That is interesting. Yeah, I know that the Trump campaign slash Republicans have returned to embracing some of these early voting techniques. We've seen in the past couple election cycles that Democrats have pulled way ahead in early voting, absentee ballots. That was traditionally a Republican stronghold in terms of vote method. So I guess it's not a huge surprise that they want to return to that. They want to get people out. They want to get people voting however they need to. But yeah, I think that they just want to capitalize on that enthusiasm and make sure that that doesn't dissipate, and that the folks who say that they're enthusiastic about voting, enthusiastic about supporting former President Trump, that they actually vote.
Absolutely. And I just wanted the last thing I'll put up here real quick is just how likely are you to vote in the election? I think we heard it back in 2016 as well, with Clinton, when she was running, people weren't as motivated to vote. They weren't as, likely to go out to the polls and vote. So I think this is interesting in the matchup we saw again in 2020, how likely people are to vote. I mean, it's still pretty high. I think with motivated voters, it looks to be pretty high still. So it doesn't look like people are sitting back, even though maybe they're not as motivated.
Yeah, and I would not take any of the likely voter numbers as gospel yet. We won't switch to a likely voter sort of framework until we get to about Labor Day. That's when the campaigns have really kicked off in earnest, when campaign spending is going to be high, when there's going to be constant media attention on the candidates. That's when the sort of least informed voter, the average voter, frankly, is going to be tuned in the most. And so, I would caution that right now, the folks who say they're very likely to vote, I'm sure that a majority of them are very likely to vote, but it's not necessarily that 92% or whatever figure. It could be lower than that, and there could be some of those folks who say, I'm considering voting, but as things shape up, as people start paying attention, that changes.
That's interesting. So we're going to have to look back at that number closer to, I guess, in those months lead up to the election. Matt, thank you so much for joining us this morning. I've taken so much of your time talking about this, but it's incredibly interesting, obviously, given the recent week we've had and also what the latest is in the Biden camp. Is there anything else, I guess, before we sign off that you just want to highlight, whether about polling or whether about people paying attention this election season?
No, I just think that, this poll has firmly put Virginia on the map as a potential swing state. So I think, expect to see more ads. Expect to see potential visits from the Trump campaign that might not have happened otherwise. Yeah, it's exciting. And I think there's going to be some additional eyes on the state.
Absolutely. And, it's sometimes called a bellwether state, sometimes it's not. So, in this election cycle, it's good for people to keep an eye on, especially with everything happening around the country. But Matt, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you for all your expertise and insight into the polling data. Thank you to everyone joining us. If you want to find out more about the Emerson College and the Hill poll, head over to Weeby.com. You can see all of the statistics over there, some that we weren't able to get to, as well as some of the charts, so you can take a look at the data for yourself. But Matt, thank you again for joining us.
Thank you, Sarah.